Thank you so much. I am so pleased to be here tonight and to see everyone. And I wanted to give a brief welcome on behalf of the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. It's so great that we're able to have this collaboration. And although we are still on Zoom, soon in person, it's wonderful that the community can come together like this. And I just wanted to say, a quick note about the speaker for tonight, Hasia Diner. At NYU, Hasia was my advisor during my PhD program. And I remember, I'm not sure, Hasia, if you remember this, but during graduation, you had, afterwards, you had mentioned, just to let you know, this relationship doesn't end with graduation. As an advisor advisee, it continues for life. And I have to say, you've been true to that. I'm so grateful that that relationship has continued, and you've always been an amazing supporter and a scholar, that I admire, and that, kind of you're setting the path. And I'm just so excited to hear you speak tonight. And to everyone, thank you for coming. And I'd like to turn it over now to Avi Noam Pat, the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. Avi.
Thanks. Thank you, Amy. It's really an honor for me to be able to offer some words of welcome and introduce Hasia Diner on behalf of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. It's very exciting, when I heard that the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford had decided to invite Hasia Diner as this year's speaker to the annual meeting. I was very excited, and I can't remember if I wrote to Amy first or to Elizabeth first, and I said, I'm so excited that they've invited Hasia, because Amy and I are both members of the NYU crew. That is, that we have had the distinct honor of receiving our PhDs in Hebrew and Judaic Studies at NYU, and literally having been mentored and advised by Hasia. My field of expertise is in modern European history, but as some of you know, I've been able to dabble a bit in American Jewish history, and that is very much because I had the privilege of taking classes with Hasia when I was at NYU, which also means that Amy and I somehow were related in some way, if we're both disciples descended from the family tree of Professor Diner. So it's a privilege for me to be able to offer some words of welcome and to co-sponsor this evening's program on behalf of the Center for Judaic Studies at UConn, and to have the privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening. Professor Hasia Diner is a native of Milwaukee. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and her doctorate from the University of Illinois. She has been at NYU since 1996, but before teaching at NYU, she taught at American University in Washington, D.C., and from 1984 to 1996 was professor of history in the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland. In 1996, she became the Paul S. and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, and was appointed director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History at NYU in 2003. She has been a distinguished visiting speaker and lecturer at numerous conferences and universities, including Williams College, Michigan State, the Jewish Theological Seminary, University of Munich, and many, many other places. She's a specialist in immigration history and the history of relations between American Jews and other ethnic and racial groups. She has written so many books and articles. I'll just give a brief overview of some of the key publications. One of her most recent books is on Julius Rosenwald as part of the Jewish Lives series published by Yale University Press, Julius Rosenwald, Repairing the World, a book which had a major influence on my own work, and which led me to ask a question that led to my newest book, was Hasia's book, We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, 1945 to 1962, in which she definitively demolished the quote unquote myth of silence that the American Jewish community did not talk about or commemorate the Holocaust in the decades after the Second World War. This book came out in 2009. She's also the author of From Arrival to Incorporation, Migrants to the United States in a Global Age, co-authored and published in 2007. A history of Jewish life in America, the Jews in the United States, 1654 to 2000, published in 2004. Hungering for America, Italian, Irish, and Jewish Foodways in the Age of Migration, which was a nominee for the James Beard Award in the Writing About Food category in 2002. I could go on, but you see there are so many books that I would spend the evening reading the list of books, and I know we want to get to our very distinguished speaker this evening. She's also the author of the book, which is the inspiration for tonight's lecture, Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World, and the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. And so I'm very excited to turn the screen over to Professor Diner to learn more about the Peddlers Who Forged the Way. Professor Diner, thank you for forging the way for two of your students who are attempting to follow in your historical footsteps. Thank you. I think Hasia is still muted.
Hasia, you need to unmute.
Okay, there. So thank you, Abby. Thank you, Amy, Elizabeth, and really everybody who's been involved in planning this and who invited me. So I always begin my talks in the age of Zoom by saying how much I wish we were all together and we could have I don't know, I guess in this weather we wouldn't have coffee, but maybe like something cold to drink afterwards. And I could perhaps hear some of your stories, because I know that is one of your missions. It's in your logo of your historical society. And but we can't. But I will begin with a question, and you can chat it in if you'd like, if you have answers, or you can talk about it in the Q&A. But for this particular subject, I like to ask how many people had grandfathers or uncles or some relative in your past who had been a peddler, who shared stories about, I see already I'm getting some waves, and who shared stories about life on the road. So I find when I was working on this book, I actually got some of my best material from people in the community who would share material with me. And I'm going to suggest to your historical society that you consider creating a kind of archive of oral history of peddlers who made from your families and who laid the groundwork of Jewish Connecticut, Jewish Hartford. So let me begin then. So I'm going to begin with a quote, and then I'm going to actually move on to a somewhat more informal talk, because again, I believe Zoom requires that of us. I'm not standing at a podium. So the quote comes from a distinguished British Jewish scholar by the name of Israel Abrams. He, in the late 19th century, was a professor of rabbinics at Cambridge University. And like many Jewish intellectuals of his day, he believed that the study of history, the study of Jewish history, was a way to defend the Jews against anti-Semitism. So in his most highly regarded work, book of 1894, 1896, which was called Jewish Life in the Middle Ages, he directly challenged a French writer by the name of Anatole Leroy-Boulot, who the previous year had asserted that Jews shunned, quote, arduous physical undertakings, that they were averse to dangerous occupations because they were cowards. Okay, Abrams sought to prove that that was not true, and that it was neither an aversion to hard work or cowardice in the face of danger which shaped Jewish life. So his answer was, quote, The Jewish peddler of recent centuries was no coward. Had he lacked courage, he must have remained at home. And that is the kind of key issue, is looking at the lives of Jewish men, because this was a male occupation, who decided to leave home and forge roads in many new places through the medium of pack peddling. Abram's words offer us a kind of template to think about Jewish peddling, Jewish migrations, and the connection between doing them, those two. So I could say in a way that going out on the road, putting a pack on one's back, graduating from carrying a pack to maybe having some kind of animal-driven cart, and going from house to house, farm to farm, was a nearly universal Jewish male experience from the end of the 18th century into the early 20th. Now, not all Jews peddled, women certainly didn't, but for some period of time, we could say that so many of them did so that peddling played a pivotal role in shaping what scholars call the Great Jewish Migration. So just to put that greatness in some context, between the end of the 18th century into the 1920s, about 1/3 of all Jews from Central and then Eastern Europe, as well as the Ottoman Empire, left their places of residence. That is, they migrated. And of that number, okay, more than 1/3 engaged in overseas migration. That is, they didn't just move to the next town, they didn't just move to the big city in their region, although so many did that as well. But again, more than 1/3 got on some kind of transport, a ship, and went off to some new land. And in that process, peddling was the engine which drove that migration. So let me begin, well, let me pause for a second and just talk about who I am considering a peddler. Now, there's some Jews who did work that was akin to peddling, but I'm not going to include that, not because they're not important, but I think they had a different history, and you'll see why. So every place Jews went, many of them were what we call, it's not a very technical term, urban peddlers. That is, they had a cart on the street, and they traversed the the streets of London, Leeds, New York, probably Hartford, Montreal, Johannesburg, Buenos Aires, and so on. And they walked the streets, they called out their wares. I guess I'm old enough to slightly remember a very old Jewish street peddler in my hometown who went up and down, and we thought this was really exotic. I'm not calling them peddlers, and you'll see the reason, not that, again, I think they deserve a history, but the reason they're different than the people I'm talking about today is because at the end of every day, those Jewish street peddlers went back to their own homes, their own apartments, okay, which were usually in some kind of Jewish neighborhood, however dense, however constituted, but they had a fixed abode. Okay, the people I'm going to be talking about today had no fixed abode. They were truly on the road. They had, and I will come back to this, a weekly circuit where every day, okay, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they were going into on the road, and they only came back to what was the semblance of home on Friday, and spent, we can call it the Sabbath, but it was also the weekend where they had time off the road. So urban peddlers were fascinating. They drew a tremendous amount of attention, but they had a different history. I'm also not going to include, although again, I think it's really fascinating, Jewish traveling salesmen, okay, that is jobbers who worked for a corporation and who got a fixed bundle of goods from from the company. And again, probably many of us, I see some other gray hair, so we probably remember the Fuller Brush Man. Okay, and the Fuller Brush Man got a bundle, a sort of box of goods from the company. He got a book that told him how to fill out the orders, and he had relatively little leeway. He also had much less risk than the peoples whose story are going to unfold this evening. So again, those Jewish traveling salesmen who worked for corporations were interesting, but they're not quite the subject tonight. But I'm rather interested in the men the immigrant Jewish men who went all over the world and put that pack on their back and went from house to house. So first, let me say about where they left and then where they went. I'm going to look a little at the specifics of some of those places, and then the commonalities, regardless of country or continent. So the Jewish migration shaped by peddling begins in the German-speaking lands, okay, in places like Bavaria and up and down the Rhine region, Alsace, Posen, okay, which is the northern part of Germany, which was historically part of Poland and then became part of Prussia. With the migration, shifted to more easterly parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the places like Galicia, Bohemia, Moravia, and then it moved to what was probably the epicenter of East European Jewish peddling, which was Lithuania. And one might say, scratch a Lithuanian Jew, okay, and affectionately, I guess, known as a Litvak, someplace around the world, and there's a peddler story. It was the most universal, ubiquitous part of Lithuanian Jewish immigration life. Okay, Jews were also leaving the Balkans. Okay, those places which were part of the Ottoman Empire that become later on Albania, Yugoslavia, all that complicated area around the Balkans, which have changed names so many times, it's almost not possible to cite what they're called right now, and also from parts of Turkey. So for example, what is now the Turkish city of Izmir sent many peddlers to South America. Okay, so this was a global Jewish emigration. And for all of these places, peddlers were the first Jews, but young men willing to take up peddling, which had in fact been a pretty common and familiar Jewish occupation in all those places anyhow. It wasn't a great leap to decide to peddle in Quebec or to peddle in Mississippi, because it was within the kind of known repertoire of occupations that Jews had had. But the largest numbers well into the 1880s and 1890s get their starts in the New World by peddling. And they paved the ground for later Jews, some of whom don't go into peddling, but it's those peddlers who become shopkeepers who laid the foundation for Jewish communal life. So obviously, where they left is very interesting, important. It had some role in where they went. So for example, Jews who spoke Ladino, okay, from the Balkans were very much directed towards Latin America, to places like Chile and Peru and Argentina, because there was enough of a linguistic familiarity, okay, between the language they knew and the language that was that of their customers. Jews from Alsace had a very strong concentration in going to Louisiana, okay, a very strong French-speaking population there, okay, although that hardly contains where they went to. So let's turn to that. So where did they go? And I've already hinted at it, but I'll say the first wave of Jewish young men who go to peddle go at the end of the 18th century to England, okay, and the British Isles. It's relatively close. They're leaving places on the other side of the North Sea and of the Baltic, and they go to England. They fan out to the English provincial towns and establish a foothold there. By the 1820s, they're coming to the United States, the new United States, and they're participating in what probably all of us, at least those of us who were American and went to American public schools, once were taught was called manifest destiny. Obviously a very problematic term, but the vast westward expansion of the United States as the country came to be linked by canals and roadways. These Jewish peddlers flocked to the United States. And indeed, in the course of the century between 1820 and 1920, 1/3 of all Jews who emigrated to a country outside of beyond their homeland came to the United States. It was the most popular destination. And one might say it was shaped in part by the nature of Americans' desire for material goods and the ability of peddlers to get it to them. Now, Jewish peddlers are going not only to the British Isles and to the United States, but they are, and we could almost make a map of the world. And let's think of it in two ways. For one thing, they were going to a number of places that had never had Jews before, although these were hardly new world. And so we see an influx of Jewish peddlers from Poland going in the 1870s and 1880s to Scandinavia, okay, to countries where Jews had actually not been allowed to live. But the Swedish censuses of the 1870s and 1880s show Jewish peddlers born in Poland listed as Jewish. Okay, a couple thousand go to Ireland, okay, and to Wales and to Scotland. Okay, so the kind of British periphery. But I think equally captivating, perhaps more, is that influx of the world that was open to white people through colonialism. The United States, Canada, Central America, Latin America, South Africa, Australia. Okay, these were all these were all Jewish migration destinations. And the peddlers were the ones who led the way for those Jews who sought out new homes. So they really have a kind of global persona. Okay, and what's remarkable, I think, about their story is that they went to places first where there were no Jews. Okay, we have amazing narratives of, for example, Jewish peddlers selling on Native American reservations. Okay, in fact, a number of Jewish peddlers got licenses from the Indian Bureau of the federal government to be able to sell on the reservation. And one of the stories, which we cannot verify, but I hope it was true, is that the Cherokee Indians used to refer to the Jewish peddlers as egg eaters. Okay, now, why egg eaters? Because when they would offer them food, and when you see food is a very important part of the story, one of my academic obsessions is the study of food, is that the Jewish peddlers would often say, I can't eat what you are offering, but I could have an egg. So they get an egg that was boiled in its shell. And so the Cherokee, who have no word for Jew, I mean, why would they? Said, oh, it's the egg eater who's coming. They often went to places where multiple languages were spoken. They went to places where French and English were spoken, or English and Spanish and Mayan were spoken, or really just fill in all the blanks for all those multilingual societies. Histories of Jewish peddlers, or narratives of Jewish peddlers in New England talk about Jewish peddlers selling to Yankees and to immigrants from Ireland and French Canadians. Okay, so the peddler must learn both English and French in order to sell his goods. Peddlers went to places which were divided not only by language, but by race. So in places like South Africa, they're selling to British, to Afrikaner. Okay, and there's an interesting story there because Afrikaans is not so terribly different than Yiddish. That it became a kind of way, sort of, there was enough overlap that they could communicate with each other. So English, Afrikaans, and Zulu. Okay, so our peddlers, and I always call them my peddlers, had to be linguistically gifted so that they could speak to everybody. And they wanted to speak to everybody because everybody was a potential customer. So we know a little bit about where they left. We know now a little bit about where they went to, and certainly where they went to, each place has its own history. Each place is worth studying in and of itself. But I want to emphasize in the time I have left to talk about what were the commonalities, what were the common experiences of Jewish peddlers if they went to upstate New York or the Mississippi Delta or the Australian outback or the Irish Midlands or the area around Cape Town or Johannesburg. What held them together? What made this a common experience? And so first is that the only Jews who do this, besides being men, and I won't repeat their maleness, although actually it'll come up again, was that they're all immigrants, because it was not a lifelong occupation. One might say it wasn't a life sentence, okay, and that peddlers came in, they sold their goods, and when there's no single metric for this, but after some number of years, become shopkeepers or owners of peddler warehouses or owners of scrap yards. Okay, so they go into retail, but it's a short period of time. People often ask how many, and I said I've seen some as little as a year and a half, and some about as long as 10 years. Okay, and presumably it had something to do with opportunities in the places they went, their skill, and so on. So, but only immigrants did it. Okay, no native-born Jewish South African was a peddler. Okay, no native-born American Jew was a peddler. It was something their fathers had done. Secondly, in terms of the commonalities between peddlers around the world, is that they went to places where there was already some skeleton, some nucleus of a Jewish population, where there were already 1, 2, 3, the number is kind of irrelevant, Jewish shopkeepers who served as their wholesalers. Okay, we have a number of peddler memoirs. There's a wonderful one of a man named Abraham Cohen, who came from Bavaria to New York in the 1850s, and he knew, I mean, what am I going to do? Okay, so he went to a synagogue on what would later be called the Lower East Side. He ran into somebody who looked familiar from back home. They established that they knew each other. They had a common cousin, a common friend, and he said, "Well, I need to make a living. I need to start working." And he said, "Well, I'll help you. I own a shop. I'll help you get started by giving you your first bundle of goods." So Jewish peddlers were dependent on Jewish wholesalers. Wholesalers, and again, the number, it varied from in terms of the size of the wholesaling operation, but the wholesalers often had multiple peddlers who worked for them. Okay, and each new peddler was given a route. Okay, and they in fact referred to it as the Medina. Okay, you had yours, I had mine. Okay, Professor Weiss had hers, and if we would ever compete with each other, if you ever encroached on mine, or maybe more likely I would encroach on yours, I'd be cut off. Okay, it operated on the basis of intra-communal trust. Okay, so each peddler had his medina given to him by his wholesaler. And again, peddlers who came to a bigger city, to Baltimore, New York, Cincinnati, didn't necessarily have a small shopkeeper who was the source of goods, but had like a peddler warehouse. Okay, in a smaller town, it would be a Jewish shopkeeper who did this. Once armed with that bundle of goods, the wholesaler also gave the new immigrant peddler a piece of paper. And on the paper, it said in Yiddish or in Ladino, "Good morning, ma'am. Okay, how are you today? Would you like to look at my bag?" Okay, and it's equivalent in Spanish, French, Cherokee, Ute, Mayan, Afrikaans, whatever the language of the region. And that became the peddler would memorize these lines and then go door to door. Now, I want to just say that at the time that peddling was such an important part of the Jewish economy, many Jewish communal leaders, important philanthropists and officials of Jewish communities thought peddling was a shameful occupation, that people kind of hated peddlers, that they were annoying, and that it was unskilled. And so when I was working on this, I tried to imagine what it would be like for me to have been given a piece of paper, okay, in a language I didn't know, and been sent out on a barge on a canal or some other conveyance to get me to my route, and have to memorize these lines and make a living that way. And it strikes me as not actually unskilled, but highly skilled. May not be learned at some great academy, but highly skilled nonetheless. So the peddler, armed with his route, with his little crib sheet. Okay, when I was in high school and took Latin, we called it a pony. Okay, and it was your cheat that you used when you got called on, and would go house to house. So peddlers went to customers who had no access to the market. Okay, people who lived too far to go to town to get their goods. They operated on the edges of larger cities. They operated in the countryside. They went to mining camps, logging camps, plantations, really any place where there were concentrations of people who had cash. Sometimes for many of these people, it was actually their first cash. And I'll give you an example in a second, but who had cash, who had just enough extra cash that they could buy the kinds of goods that peddlers sold, which I'm going to call popular luxuries. Okay, so the peddlers didn't sell food, they didn't sell fuel. Okay, and I guess we might say those are the only things that one absolutely needs. But you don't really need sheets and towels or pillowcases or curtains or mirrors, eyeglasses, although I guess in our world, eyeglasses are akin to clothes and food and fuel. They sold needles and thread and cloth and mirrors and pretty much anything they could put on a pack on their back. And they tapped we might say, the fantasy of consumption for people who were relatively poor, but who had a little bit of extra cash. So many of the customers were people who had just been integrated into the cash economy. So I said I would give an example. So in the early 1920s, Shell Oil opened refineries in Curacao. And most of the workers were recruited from the plantations, and they were recruited by from subsistence farmers, people who had grown a crop, ate it, and that's how they lived. But Shell Oil built these refineries, offered them to come into Curacao from the countryside, put up some housing, and paid them a cash wage. And within 3 weeks of these refineries going up, there were Jewish peddlers from Poland in Curacao selling these kinds of goods. Okay, again, selling neckties. And there's some amazing stories of women whose husbands worked in sugarcane plantations, rubber plantations in the Amazon, who bought from the peddlers neckties, suspenders, and pocket handkerchiefs for their husbands. And while we can't know what they were thinking when they bought these items because they didn't leave us those memoirs, but I think we can take a leap and say that but for a woman to buy her husband a necktie meant that when he went into town, let's say to church or to some community event, and he wore his necktie, he wasn't just a sugarcane plantation worker, he was a gentleman. In other words, it enhanced the status of the family. So that should be a clue to the next commonality about these peddlers, which is the peddlers sold to women. Okay, even when they sold gentlemen's goods, they sold to women. Men were out during the day working, and so a kind of bond developed between the peddlers and the women. And I had a feeling during question and answer, somebody's going to ask about intermarriage, and it definitely happened. And we have, again, amazing stories from around the world. Okay, the peddlers were every place. It doesn't matter if it was Curacao or Cape Town, okay, or Mississippi or the Pacific Northwest. They had a weekly circuit. They went to the same houses on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. And as I indicated before, they came back to some little node or large node of Jewish life at the end of the week, okay, Friday, and rested, okay, presumably had a good meal. And Saturday night, they went back to their creditors, paid up what they owed, filled up their bags, and Sunday morning were back on the road again. So in Ireland, they were actually called weekly men. Okay, and in England, they called themselves Wochers, from the Yiddish or German word Woch. And in Latin America, they were Semananics. Okay, and so that week that was built into their schedule and into their lives during the week. And I don't know if anybody is yet asking, well, where do they sleep and where do they eat? And in the ideal, and it seems to have been pretty common, they slept in their customers' homes. So they would ask the last customer of the day, and again, because they had the same route, they knew who that was going to be, and they tried to make it so that the last customer was the nicest. Okay, can I stay here for the night? And there are relatively few stories from the narratives that have come down to us of peddlers being abused by their customers. There's a great story from someplace in the South where peddler knocks on the door and the woman said, "I don't let Yankees into my house." And he said, "Well, I'm not a Yankee, I'm Jewish." She said, "Oh, then that's okay, you can come in." And so they slept in their homes and they developed relationships with these people. Again, one peddler in his memoir said, "They asked me where I was from and I said, Bohemia." Okay, and well, where's Bohemia? Okay, so he explains to him where Bohemia was. Now, many of the peddlers, and again, we can't know the number, would in the morning pray. They would take out their prayer shawls and their tefillin. And again, the customers ask, "What are you doing?" I mean, they'd never seen this before. And they explain, I'm Jewish and this is what we do. We do this every day. And so again, we can see a kind of learning experience where the peddler is a kind of neophyte teacher of interfaith education. And one amazing story, and again, it's just so impossible to verify, of a man who was a peddler, a Lithuanian man who was a peddler in South Dakota, and he sold primarily to German immigrants. And they knew him, and a number of them approached him and said, Moses, we have asked you a favor. Our minister died, and it'll be months till the denomination, the Lutheran denomination, sends us a new minister. Would you come on Sundays and lead our services? You're such a pious man. So his daughter, who wrote the memoir, said he was so proud of the fact that he came every Sunday for a couple of months, and he discussed with them the Parsha of the week. And she said he really liked the fact that he taught them about Rashi. So they developed this kind of bond. Now, if they slept in a customer's home, the customer then offered them food. And the food could be pork or squirrel or bear or whatever else that is a delicacy or the staple of consumption in all sorts of places, but certainly not kosher, and probably things that none of us would eat if we kept kosher or not. So again, we had these narratives where the peddler would say, can't eat it. Well, why not? Well, I'm Jewish. Jews are not allowed to eat pork. So again, takeaway, what could you eat? I can eat bread, I can eat vegetables, I can eat fruit. Some of the peddlers would actually leave a pot in a customer's home and cook his own food. Okay, so there is this kind of modus vivendi built around on non-ideological tolerance, non-ideological religious tolerance. It's not that they love Jews, but they knew the peddler, he was a good guy. So I don't want to end on a totally positive note. I'm going to actually end on a positive note, but I want to inject a somewhat grimmer story here. And then I'll come to the positive conclusion. So every place they went, they not only had a weekly cycle, everywhere they went, they not only sold to women, they not only sold these kind of goods that I've iterated before, they not only moved from a backpack to a wagon driven by a horse or an ox or a mule, whatever was the prevailing beast of burden. But everywhere they went, they raised the ire of local merchants. Local merchants hated them, okay? Because even though the customers had difficulty getting into town, the peddler could vastly undersell the merchant who had a store, who had a fixed a place from which he did his business. So wherever in
Hasia, we're just having a little trouble with the connection for a moment here. Hold on.
seems to be working. Okay, great. Okay, well, let me then just really wrap this up. Anyhow, there was peddler action, anti-peddler action every place. There were ugly images in newspapers and magazines. But interestingly, it rarely had anything to do with there being Jews and more with the economic competition. The same things were said about Yankee peddlers. Okay, Connecticut was actually a big state that sent out peddlers in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and they received the exact same treatment as Jewish peddlers did. And certainly peddlers were robbed, okay, and they were murdered. Okay, but we have no reason to think they were either robbed or murdered because they were Jews, but because they were men without weapons on the road with cash and jewelry and watches and pretty attractive for some local bad guys. Okay, so again, I don't want to take too much of your time, and I'm so sorry about the glitch, but let me just say that as I indicated earlier, it was a less than a one generational phenomenon. Jewish peddlers had their time on the road, and then they settled down, they opened shops. Some became fabulously wealthy, and we probably all know names like Lehman and Rosenwald and Seligman and Strauss, as in Macy's, and Strauss also as in the blue jeans you wear with the name on the back, and so many more. Most did not, but most, in fact, ended their lives, if not well off, certainly not on the road. So, ending with Israel Abrams, they were clearly not cowards. They clearly were not afraid of arduous occupations, but rather they understood they could not stay at home because there were dwindling opportunities for young Jewish men, and were adventurous enough to move out to unknown places and remake their lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hasia. We did gather a few questions while we were waiting for you to reappear on our Zoom. So one of them asks, is it likely that peddlers we all knew here were originally peddlers in Poland or in their, country of origin?
Yeah, so that's really a great question. And so many of them are very young, and it may not be that they were peddlers, but their fathers were. And so it was familiar, but they may not have themselves done this. In fact, I've seen very few stories where they talk about that, but rather it was the familiarity of it that was the draw, which again doesn't mean it wasn't the case. It's just we have such spotty evidence, but it's a great question.
Yeah, and was that kind of same long distance peddling common in Eastern Europe and Germany among
Yeah, so that's great. Yeah, that's great. So yes, I mean, Jews peddled. I mean, there was one study of a town in Poland, and it said everybody pedals. I mean, it's not like everybody does it, but there are some differences that were really notable, which is in Europe, again, in the German lands, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, parts of the Russian Empire. Peddlers did not have a weekly route, but they'd be on the road for months, and they would always take shelter in Jewish communities. And they'd find a Jewish town, the Jewish neighborhood or a Jewish town, and they would stay there. And so that they might return home only for the Jewish holidays. Okay, but they'd be gone for months on end. There were actually Jewish women who peddled in Europe. It wasn't just men. The New World peddling was this male weekly circuit.
Great, thank you. We had a couple of questions that I'll just put all together into one question,
Okay.
if you don't mind. Where did the peddlers keep their money? Did they use banks? How many hours did they work? And did they usually have beards, and did they always wear some kind of hat?
Okay, great. Okay, so interestingly, their wholesaler, the shopkeeper or the whoever it was they were getting their goods, also held their money for them.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, and so again, you can see why this is so dependent on trust. Okay, and any link in this chain, this Jewish commercial chain that broke the bonds of trust would be essentially lose his reputation in the community. Okay, so very important. Some of them had beards. Most of the ones I've seen have been clean shaven, but some did, and that was kind of a comment here and there. They often wore top hats. They actually dressed kind of elegantly, and they wore a very distinguished kind of hat, and sometimes would have a vest with a jacket, and they didn't want to look like riffraff. Okay, but rather this is somebody, knocks on your door, you're going to let them in. Okay, and so they made a point of looking pretty sharp.
Yeah, interesting. And can you say just a few words about the transition out of peddling? Because you said it was usually, not a long-term occupation, and that men usually tried to establish themselves somewhere more settled as soon as they could.
Right, yeah. So it's a great question. So many of them actually end up opening shops in the region in which they had peddled. Because the customers already knew them and theoretically liked them, and they would have saved this money. Now, for many, and this, I saw a question that kind of popped up, and it's actually related. I don't know if it's in your bundle there of questions. For many Jewish peddlers who were single men, opening the shop was their chance to marry, okay, or in order to open a shop, they had to marry because they had to have a wife there to work behind the counter and help them out. So particularly in the, through about the 1870s, 1880s, those who came from Central Europe would often go back home. They peddled for a couple years. They now had pretty nice clothes, and they would go back home to find a bride. And they would, again, there's some great stories of men who would go back to find a wife, or they may have had a sweetheart back there, and they would bring back that woman's sisters and female friends and cousins who would be marriage partners then for the other Jewish bachelors who made up the kind of peddling community. Remember, they all basically spent the Sabbath and the weekend at the home of the same creditor. Okay, so they knew each other. Told by the Lithuanian Jewish peddlers tended, in the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th, tended to be married men who left their wives back home and then would send for them, or they were married men who left their wives in the big city in New York or Chicago or Baltimore, and when they came back on the weekend, they'd be with their wife and children. And so it really varied from kind of, I think, historically in this, but the issue, the connection between marriage and peddling, marriage and shopkeeping was very important.
Great, thank you so much. Intriguingly, I see somebody here says they have the original 1930s push cart of the sort my father and grandfather used to sell fruits and vegetables in Brooklyn. So that's more of the urban peddling that you were mentioning at the beginning. Do you have any ideas about, are there museums and so on that would collect, that kind of material?
Right. I mean, it depends where it comes from. I know that the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati has collected some of this. And actually, when you come into the museum park, there's a peddler's wagon. And Isaac Mayer Wise, who founds the Hebrew Union College, had so much to say about peddlers. And so it's actually very appropriate that that the museum and the campus of the institution he founded has this. There is a Jewish museum in Atlanta, the Beeman or Berman, and it is focused primarily on Atlanta. It too has a peddler's cart, as does the Smithsonian, the Museum of American History. And so the question is, what are the local historical societies that have the kind of space? But it is such an important, it's important not just for the peddlers and for the Jewish historical part of it, but also for the customers. And so there was a man who became the president of Columbia, South America. And in his memoir, he said, no peasant in our town ever had a pair of shoes until the Jewish peddlers came. So, I mean, what these peddlers do is they transform the lives of the people who live there. And as I said, many of the peddlers carried eyeglasses, which to me was a really kind of amazing thing. So that if I couldn't find my glasses in the morning, I would be lost. I couldn't get up. And so what does it mean? It means you can read. And it means you are part of the world in a way you can't if you don't have glasses. And so it was transformative of the lives of the customers. And so it's as much a part of the history of rural Ireland or rural Sweden or rural Colombia as it is a Jewish history.
Yeah, fascinating, really fascinating. The history of consumption and people buying, what people are able to buy, when, and so on. Absolutely. Great. Well, it seems like those are most of the questions that people have come out with. And if anyone would like to hang around and share stories of their Hartford or their family, peddlers and their family, we'd be happy to hear that. But please join me in thanking Professor Diner for a wonderful talk. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Ken, I'm sorry my technology
No, worked out fine.
failed me.